I'm just going to very briefly introduce the panel members. This is Dr. Redonda Miller, the president of Johns Hopkins Hospital, and I learned that she first came to Hopkins as a medical resident.
28 years ago.
So she has a great perspective that will be really interesting on drug prices and drug access from that perspective. And we also have Dr. Jeremy Greene. He is a historian of medicine. He's written a bunch of great books on generic drugs and has been a great source to me always for my reporting on drug prices. So he gives kind of the long view, which is kind of refreshing in this age of sort of short-term news pegs that we're in. So I'm going to start with questions, but if things arise, please participate. I think that would make it a lot better. But we're going to start. President Trump is giving us a news peg. This week, he is expected to finally give a long-awaited speech on drug prices and what his plan is to lower them. This has been rumored and awaited for a really long time since he campaigned on this issue, and no one knows exactly what to expect, but the rumor mill is running. And I just wanted to ask both of you maybe to start what you expect him to say and maybe what you hope, if you could kind of whisper in his ear what you might suggest. Redonda?
Sure. Well, I will be honest, I don't know what he will say. I have suspicions just from hints he's gleaned over the last year or two, things he might be thinking about. Certainly along Part B Medicare, I think he's probably talking a lot about insurers negotiating prices directly. For Part D, patients feeling these prices out of pocket, and I think he might be thinking a little bit about rebates. Patients usually get their medicines through a pharmacy benefit manager, who then contracts with the supplier, the manufacturer, the pharma company, and there's a discount involved in whether those rebates make it to the patient or not, and what percentage. So I think he might have something to say on that. Things that maybe he might want to go to bulk purchasing for Part D. We have not done that as a country. It's not legal right now, but changing statutes such that Medicare could bulk purchase drugs and perhaps compete with some other developed countries. And personally, I hope he talks a little bit about problems with the generic market and just transparency in general around pricing. Just transparency in general. I think that would be a good watchword from my vantage point.
Yeah, I would second that. I mean, I would love to see the president's policies take on the problem of off-patent drug pricing and how they have been escalating in particular. So far, we've seen very little indication that that will be on the table. But then again, none of us really know what he will say. I think, very famously, of course, on the campaign trail, the president mentioned that the pharmaceutical industry is getting away with murder and that he would take this on directly. There would be tough talk for the pharmaceutical industry. There was a day of tough talk. Since then, it's been hard to see a tremendous amount of daylight between the president's policy proposals and the interests of the research-based pharmaceutical industry. That will be a very important thing to watch for with what takes on. That being said, I do think that if we analyze what has been put forward through the president's budget so far, and we have I just want to say I'm representing not only myself, but we have an interdisciplinary team of healthcare policy analysts working on the problem of pharmaceutical pricing at Johns Hopkins, headed up by my colleague Jerry Anderson, Professor Jerry Anderson. And so far, that analysis really suggests that there's been very little that would move on the generic drug issue so far, and that the policy would wind up substantially benefiting the research-based pharmaceutical industry. That being said, two things I do think we will see. Well, one thing is it seems hard to avoid the benefit of value-based pricing at this point in time. So I think we've reached a point where many different stakeholders across industry, across government, payers groups, insurers, consumers groups will say we need to start thinking more carefully about value when it comes to pharmaceutical pricing. That being said, when so many stakeholders agree on one thing, there's almost a guarantee that it means different things to each of them. And there are many different definitions of what value-based pricing is. So getting that right and looking carefully at that will be important. I agree entirely with Redonda about the importance of transparency. I think if I could ask for a single thing for the president's policy to lean on, it would be increasing the transparency in the pharmaceutical pricing process, so that the many steps between producer and consumer in which prices become inflated can actually be opened up, aired out, and something could be done to figure out where the problem lies.
We'll see. So I'm just going to maybe also step back. So I write for a general audience about this issue, and people have really strong kind of feelings because they've all been to the pharmacy or have friends and family who've been to the pharmacy and been shocked at a price they saw in a bill or the price that they paid for a medicine or a price they couldn't afford. But I think, as a reporter about this issue, you just quickly find yourself like taking the Russian doll apart, and you're like, wow, a drug price is this, but it also includes all these fees, and there's the part the patient pays, what the insurer pays, what society pays, and there's levels of, as you said, no transparency into that. So maybe just when you think about the problem of skyrocketing drug prices, what do you even think is the drug price? How do you talk about it in a specific way without just making a political point? What's the real core of the problem to both of you?
Well, I mean, sure. I would say as a provider, I see patients in a community health center in East Baltimore, and the price that's most important to me on a weekly basis, daily basis, is the out-of-pocket price for the patient. Because then again, in my practice, I also see a lot of uninsured and underinsured patients. And so this gets to the question of what is a list price versus a net price versus the price the payer sees. And the list price, and I think many people in this room will already know this, but for those of you who don't, the list price is an elaborate fiction, and it is suspended by a number of different sources. It ultimately winds up being higher than what is actually paid by the payer, and that's a different thing from what the actual patient pays out of pocket in the pharmacy. At the same time, so the difference between the list price and the net price has to do with what discounts are applied along this chain of consumer between the manufacturer, the wholesaler, the pharmacy benefit manager, or group purchasing organization, and the ultimate consumer. But one of the problems that we have is that if you don't have insurance, the list price is the price that you pay. So even though I can say on the one hand the list price is a fiction, for many people the list price is a very hard and fast reality, and I face that regularly in my clinic.
For me, number one, first and foremost, the price that we worry about most is just what Jeremy said. It's the price the patient feels. And in the era of high deductible plans, when many of our citizens across the country are turning to those plans, I think we're at 1 in 3 now, maybe have a high deductible plan, it's huge. That price that you pay, that you feel out of pocket, is key. If I put on my hospital administrator hat, though, and I think about what the price means to me, obviously it's the book of business, the drugs that we purchase. At the Johns Hopkins Hospital, we spend about $147 million a year, one hospital, on our medications. Between 2014 and 2015, the cost of those drugs escalated exponentially on the order of 20% over that 1 year. And a lot of that was due to issues with the generic, loss of competition in the generic market, perhaps some behavior with sudden escalations in drug prices, but nonetheless, a decent rise for us. When you think about Johns Hopkins in totality, and I say this just as an illustration for health systems in general and also employers in general. So if you add in what our hospitals spend for medications for patients, but then you think about our book of business in the outpatient arena and what we spend on our employees. We have our own insurance program for our employees. We're self-insured, and so we buy medications. The total amount spent for one health system was $655 million. And over 2 years, it went up 28%. So now just multiply that by not only other health systems across the country, but employers in general. And you can see the challenge we're facing as a country and how dire it is. So when I think about drug price, it's all of that mixed in. What we spend as a health system trickles down to the patient, right? It eventually trickles down to the patient, and that's our number one concern.
Yeah, so why don't we talk about some specific drugs? Right now we're on the age of this exciting new scientific time where There are gene therapies, there are new ways of treating previously untreatable diseases, potentially curing diseases. So, and that is kind of the coolest stuff. It's the kind of stuff hospitals, doctors love, get excited about, but it is coming with huge price tags, you know, drugs nearly $1 million, maybe more. There was an analyst note today about hemophilia gene therapy, speculating on how much that one could be. So how do you think about this new age we're in and the trade-offs that it involves?
So, you know, I like to think we spent a decade sequencing the genome, and all of that good labor is now bearing fruit in the fact that we're seeing these revolutionary gene products, biologics in general, able to target diseases with precision unprecedented. I mean, it's actually just what you would expect from the advancement of medicine. The problem is we're so new and the therapies are so new that they're on patent, there hasn't been market competition, so the prices haven't fallen as you would expect long term. I think about specific examples at the hospital. Spinraza, are you familiar with nusinersen? Let me tell you, this is a story that I think illustrates a lot of what we're facing with this new technology. Spinraza, nusinersen is the generic name, is a medication that treats spinal muscular atrophy. This is a disease, a genetic disease. You are born with it, and it's usually a spontaneous mutation, but type 1, there are different types. Type 1 is the most severe. Children who have type 1 spinal muscular atrophy rarely live to see age 3. I like to think of it sort of like a Lou Gehrig's of children, in a way that, you know, you lose muscle mass and eventually your diaphragm's a muscle and it's a fatal disease. This new therapy is revolutionary. We are a center of excellence at Hopkins, and Dr. Crawford, a pediatric neurologist, saw these patients, was instrumental in bringing it in clinical trials to the bedside, and has a cohort of patients where, I mean, we can see the videos. These children that historically would have died, you can see them over time crawl, start to walk upstairs. It seems to halt progression. The price tag the first year is $750,000. It's lifelong therapy, and every year subsequent to the first year is $325,000 every year in perpetuity. So, I mean, you can imagine how do we pay for this, not only from a hospital perspective, but from a societal perspective. How are we going to afford to do this? But yet in your heart, how can you afford not to? You have this child's life in your hand. So that illustrates some of what we're wrestling with, if that helps at all.
What has access been like for patients at Hopkins?
So we focused on, and this was also historic too, so we focused on patients who were similar to who was treated in the trial, right? The children with type 1. The problem is, or maybe it's the good thing in this case, is usually the FDA approves medications based on what the indications were in the trial. So if this population of patients were studied in the trial, that is who the drug is approved for. But because this was so revolutionary, the FDA did not put restrictions or limits or in their approval process that, well, you should only treat kids in this age group with type 1. They said it's so promising, it might help everyone. So type 2, type 3, all ages, adults. Do you treat someone who's had slowly progressive disease, who's 50 and doing reasonably well, but continues to deteriorate? How do you make those judgment calls? It has caused a lot of ethical conversations, not only in institutions who are delivering this therapy, but across the country at national meetings and professional organizations. Where's the right cutoff? How do we wrestle with it? I will tell you, Hopkins doesn't have the answers yet. And we've really focused on rolling it out to our patients who need it the most, with the hopes that we're going to continue to roll it out over time to everyone who would benefit. But it's tough.
Yeah, I mean, even that like small delay in terms of the logistics of a hospital system to a family is like an eternity, because I followed a family that was just waiting for insurance approval for months, and they had been trying to get into the trials, and you know,
Yes.
for them, they're just watching their son slowly get worse, and it's heartbreaking, as you can understand. But it's the time frame for a family and the time frame for a hospital is like, it's like geologic time versus like the blink of an eye, I feel like. And then, Jeremy, you've written so much about the problem of off-patent drugs and competition in that space. And it's kind of a different problem because often these drugs, at least, they're old. They're not, they're not so hard to make depending on what the drug is. And the idea is that they should be cheap because the kind of leash of patent protection that gives the power of the drug company to price that drug however they want has expired. And so you're expecting those drugs should be the ones that are like a slam dunk, no problem. But what are your is there any drug you would highlight in this area?
Well, I mean, there are unfortunately several. And I would like to think, I wish that it were the case that the problem of off-patent drugs increasing in prices is really rare and isolated. But we've learned that more than a third of off-patent drugs since the Hatch-Waxman Act, which we can get more to in a little bit, I guess, which balances innovation and access and created the pathway for generic drugs in 1984. A survey I did with some colleagues showed that more than a third of these drugs are produced by 3 or fewer manufacturers, which means there's not a truly competitive market. And we see the prices. Of course, in general, the prices of generic drugs have gone down, and this is this thing that we've come to expect, that we've naturalized the life phase of drugs, that in the first patent-protected phase of its existence, the drug is expensive, and we say it needs to be expensive to recoup the cost of innovation. But when that federally supported monopoly or market exclusivity ends, then the invisible hand swoops in, all these competitors come in, generic competition works and brings prices down, and that's how we tend to balance access and innovation in the United States, at least. And yet, it's been breaking down in so many different arenas. Martin Shkreli certainly helped to popularize this and became, briefly, I think, the internet's most hated person. And of course, that's a hard thing to hold on to these days. But he was recently convicted of fraud on an independent charge. You may remember that at the time, when asked why he did what he does, he effectively said, "Well, it's not illegal. I did it because I could." In the state of Maryland, a number of us at Hopkins worked carefully to try to think about policy mechanisms that could be brought to bear to help close that loophole. And many of you may know the state of Maryland last year passed a law making price gouging on an unconscionable price increase of an off-patent drug illegal. Now that became the subject of a constitutional challenge, and the Fourth Circuit recently ruled that the Maryland law was unconstitutional because it violated what is known as the Dormant Commerce Clause, and we can get into that later, suggesting that actually the federal government, on the current reading, suggests that only the federal government can take action on price gouging on off-patent prescription drugs. You asked for a specific example. I'm sorry, and one I would give is very much on my mind right now is insulin, and I can ask this room, although this is not really a Q&A yet, how many generic insulins are available in the United States? I think the answer properly is 0. There are 2 follow-on biologicals now, which have very modest price decreases compared to the originals. But this is a drug. Insulin was first invented in 1921. It was first patented in 1923. It's really in the past 10 years. It took me a while in my practice to begin to realize that of the many different reasons that patients struggle to control their diabetes with insulin, there's many problems. It's a hard drug to use. It's a hard regimen to keep up. I didn't think cost would be one of them because the drug had been around forever. But if you actually study what happened with insulin, there's been a series of different patented versions of insulins that emerged just about when the old one is going off patent. And so we have not seen the development of a robust insulin market, a generic insulin market in this country. 1 in 4 of patients living with diabetes in the United States today reported that in the last year they have either rationed or not been able to use insulin for a period of time because of cost. And so here you have an old drug, 95 years since its patent, which is increasingly inaccessible. Insulin prices rose, by one account, 270% in the last decade.
Yes, that's a great example, and yeah, as a reporter, having written about that again, it's one where patients rightly have kind of no idea why they should. I mean, why should there be any cost sharing at all on insulin? It's in the health system and payers' interest to keep you out of the hospital and out of having like life-threatening reactions to being off of it. So, but that's our system. So maybe to get to topic of blame, which is one that is commonly, there's a lot of finger pointing in this space. And it becomes almost just hard to distinguish what the truth is once the finger pointing really starts, because it can get so back and forth. I guess, where do you see blame? And a lot of health policy experts that I talk to always talk about how everyone likes to blame everyone else, but high drug prices basically sort of benefit everyone in the system a little bit, arguably, except for the patient, including potentially doctors who might get a % of the list price in some cases, or hospitals that can, on their margins. All of the lack of transparency in the system means it's often hard to tell how much that's the problem, but it makes it also hard to really get to the root of it. So I guess when you think about blame or places to focus, where do you think the best pressure point would be?
It really, in my mind, comes down to a couple different problems. I'll go first to what I said initially, is just transparency. To your point, it's so complicated how the price someone feels, whether you're a patient, a hospital, it's so complicated. So just trying to lay it all out and understand the formulas and the structure behind it would be incredibly helpful. Blame is a tough word. It's hard to finger point, like you said, when everyone perhaps is acting in a way they feel is their right or is okay. But I think when I think about the drug pricing problem, it sort of comes down to two categories for me. One is the product of new technology, new innovation, and how do we deal with that? And that feels like a different answer than the second issue I'll talk about in a second. So with that first issue, these are great new treatments, specialty drugs. They are high cost, but highly complex, hard to administer. They really are revolutionary. And I think 10 years ago, there were maybe 5 or 6 specialty drugs, and now they're 40% of the market, soon to be 50% of the drug market. So they've just proliferated, and it's the product of this revolution. And so how do we price those? And I think I would be the first to say research and development, R&D, needs to be appropriately recouped for pharma, absolutely, because without that, we won't continue to have innovation. But how do we also price them based on value? And we can talk about that perhaps in a little bit, but in my mind, not every new therapy brings huge value to the patient. Some are tiny little steps, some are me too, some have incremental huge gains in value. So thinking about how we might price along those lines would be helpful to me. The second group that I talked about would be going back to the generics, a sole source provider of a medication in the marketplace, and how we handle that. And blame there, is perhaps some of it has to go with ethical behavior, I will say, and we need to have someone watching over that, watching over our marketplace, whether this is a central office in the federal government, a czar, so to speak, someone who can look for changes in our generic marketplace and implement regulations, reform, controls, whatever we need to do to make sure that doesn't happen and keep that above board. And that's a different sort of, it's easier to put blame in that area as opposed to the product of the new revolution, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point you're raising here, that there's a structural transformation that's happened, and that there was a system that seemed to work fairly well for a while for small molecules, perhaps, right? That we would balance innovation and access, we've been talking about before. And yet there's a number of transformations that have changed that. The emergence of the specialty market, for whom the guarantee that there will be some moment in which these incredibly expensive medications become affordable is really not there, right? There's not a tremendous amount of faith right now. There's hope for biosimilars, perhaps, and follow-on biologicals to do this, but so far we really haven't seen much evidence that they will provide the kind of robust pathway for dramatic cost savings that allow very expensive drugs to become affordable. And of course, the price that we need to come down from in the specialty market is so much higher than anything was. Like a blockbuster drug like Lipitor was like pennies in comparison to where these prices are. At any rate, the element of the specialties is one part of this problem. The other has to do with the decreasing competitiveness happening within the generic sector. So what has happened with an industry which, when Hatch-Waxman was passed, was a bunch of small companies that really, seemed to jump in to try and produce competitive marketplaces, has seen a lot of mergers and acquisitions, has consolidated. So on some level, one thing this czar would need to do would be to actually work, for example, with the FTC to really closely oversee what are the long-term consequences of mergers that happen by increasingly large generic firms. So generic firms are now as large as any other form of multinational pharmaceutical firm. So we exist in a very different environment. But the other thing I would mention in terms of blame is the importance of coming back to transparency. That right now we have a system in which all parties are able to blame each other in a way that helps create a form of churn in which nothing is really done. And so if you are a pharmaceutical manufacturer, and by the way, I'm certainly not anti-industry. I don't want any of my comments to come across in that respect. I'm entirely dependent on the industry, both as a doctor and a patient. But if you are an industry, if you're a pharmaceutical manufacturer and you can say, well, I need to have this high list price because these steep discounts need to happen before I actually see my profit. Then, meanwhile, if you are a PBM, a benefit manager, and you say, well, I'm actually involved in helping medicines cheaper, but I can't disclose my discounts because that would make my model of reducing the cost for everybody impossible. We have a process where not only is everyone blaming each other, but everyone's blaming each other in a way in which the obvious solution, which would be to increase transparency, that we can actually see what the discounts are, still somehow is reserved from the table. And so it's an arena in which without strong federal action, we're not going to actually see anything happen. There are parties within the federal government that could make drug pricing more transparent. And I think that's really what needs to happen for us to make progress here.
Yeah, well, again, we'll see. So one of the things, because you think about this from the historical perspective, and we've talked in the past, like it always feels like a very present issue. Drug prices are too high, and it's part of this new moment we're in, and it's the past 3 years that we've been in, and Congress gets really angry at CEOs. But this isn't a new issue, right? And kind of what can the past teach us about the moment we're in, what to expect?
Well, thank you for that opening, Carolyn. As a historian of medicine, I'm always grateful for the opportunity to talk about the importance of history in the present. And I think we oftentimes have a policy memory when we talk about health policy in this country, which if we go back 10 years, that's considered a decent stretch. And here we can go back much further. I mean, if we look at the hearings of Senator Estes Kefauver, which began in the late 50s and then went into the early 60s, Kefauver at the time, think about this, right? Here you have this moment when the first generation of post-World War II wonder drugs, right? This real expansive moment in which the American pharmaceutical industry predominantly is showing the ability to build entire new categories of drugs, antibiotics, cardiovascular drugs, antihypertensives, drugs to actually combat mental illness. And they're all going off patent, and yet they're all still really expensive. And it is increasingly a problem for consumers to bear. And Kefauver held a series of wide-ranging hearings using the power of the subpoena to actually bring all parties in the system together and demonstrate what was a brand name drug, what was a generic name of a drug, where did the industry make its profits. If all these drugs are basically do the same thing, why are they being sold differently? It was a quite remarkable moment. It was an initial moment, I would point to, in which we see widespread politicization of prescription drug prices as something that were both at the moment becoming untenable and also were a key element of national policy. Now since then, I would argue we've seen these rise and falls of moments where drug prices become seemingly untenable. They reach a threshold where these prices cannot be borne. There are hearings, but very little is done about them. And we can see this recursive moment that you're talking about. The thing that comes with this, every historian thinks about continuity and change. Simply saying history is a cycle doesn't really describe the fact that it's slightly different every time. I do think that we've reached a moment where the prices of new drugs are becoming so untenable that it becomes hard for us to justify the public health benefit of them if the average American does not feel they will be able to share in that innovation. And so I think we're at a moment where the real change is possibly on the horizon, but it requires political will, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens tomorrow, for example, and in coming months.
Yeah. Are there any questions for the panel? Or?
Speaking of political will, I wondered if you had any thoughts about the recent right to try legislation that failed to move forward, and any impact that might have on drug pricing with new products and that value to the patient.
Sure. Well, I mean, personally, I was a bit puzzled by the right to try legislation because it was one of these situations. Of course, we have this balance between federal and state prerogatives in this policy arena, as with any, and yet most states have provisions for right to try. So the actual number of patients who are at a stage in which compassionate care or demands the ability to actually try these medications, who would not already have been covered by existing measures that would have been covered by the federal measure. It was very hard for me to see the difference there. So it's my personal analysis there. But I'm not sure how the right to try legislation would have improved problems of drug costs. But it is a very important issue to continue following.
Yeah, I've always been interested in why we have very large global pharmaceutical companies, but we don't, as individual countries, come up with a multinational approach. Because, Maryland is no match for Pfizer, but a multinational, conglomerate of discussions between Canada and all these other countries would certainly be a start in coming up with something that we could all use to address everybody. And a question I always have, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on, whether as a country, should we decide whether healthcare is a right or is it a commodity? Because the solutions are different. Because as a commodity, we like to use language like free market when we know it's not a free market. And then if we think it's a right, what happened to Bay-Dole and walk-in rights, marchin rights, and all those sorts of things that we don't seem to ever discuss publicly? Thank you.
I think your comments about a multinational approach are very interesting, and certainly there is power in numbers, so to speak. Right now, there's a bit of an imbalance in drug pricing across developed countries. As you know, the price of certain drugs here are significantly higher for patients in the US than, say, Denmark or Sweden or Canada, and some of that has to do with bargaining power. So I don't know how much the other countries are interested in talking about perhaps a leveling of that pricing across borders. But nonetheless, the other difference I might say between some of the other countries, they have a more advanced system of asking for value of new drugs than we do. They have national bodies. I mean, we do too, but not necessarily with the authority. Thinking of ICER and other groups, but in general, they have a more robust process of actually evaluating drugs for their citizens and what value they may bring. Is the extension of life or the improvement of disease worth this dollar amount? Probably perhaps where we need to give some thought to in our country. So I don't know that it's come across the table. There's so many differences. I think we could learn from each other, and probably as a unified voice, if we meet in the middle on certain places, it could be very powerful. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, and I would echo that. It's interesting that your suggestion of a multinational approach, because I would almost lean on other nations having strong national approaches, which is why we can explain the significant cost discrepancies. Insulin costs 6 times less in Europe than it does in the United States, right? But predominantly because other countries have had different abilities to use bargaining power on price. Now, that being said, there have been examples in the past of multinational approaches through the United Nations. The World Health Organization maintains a list of essential medicines. Started off in the late 70s. Now, when it was first set up, it was quite contentious because the concept of saying an essential medicine is something that should be available at a reasonable price for all citizens everywhere because it is of such public health importance that it just needs to effectively be like water and clean air. Now, the United States was very opposed to this when this took shape, and actually the US FDA had wrote to the Secretary General of the WHO and said, you might not want to call them essential. If you called them basic medicines, such that other medicines were more advanced, the United States would be willing to get on board with that. But if you call them essential and then other things seem frivolous or extraneous, then we really can't agree with that. That being said, since that moment, we haven't seen so much success of using multinational bodies like the World Health Organization to really create a leverage point for price. I think the nation state has been a much more effective tool.
to ask about the relationship between drug prices and drug shortages. I've read a little bit periodically about, for instance, shortages of sort of mission-critical products in the operating room. And I wonder if it's thought that pricing contributed to or was a factor in those shortages, or if it's that's really quite a different situation.
So I can speak to this a little bit because we have a list. So at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, we have a list of drugs on shortage that we work every day. That list is around 150 drugs. And how we approach those is we have a multidisciplinary team come together around each drug, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and think about what we can do to mitigate that for our patients. Is there a way we can obtain more somehow? Can we make it ourselves? Can we substitute equally effective medications, always with safety and quality front and foremost in our minds? We don't want a patient to be harmed. But what can we do if they're, what can we do to make sure we have the quantity? The reason behind those shortages is multifactorial, as you can imagine. The most recent mini bags, the saline mini bags, was because of hurricane action in Puerto Rico, and Baxter lost their manufacturing capability. So that was a problem. Other times it is related to, there are 2 factories and one factory was just shut down by a governmental agency because of violations, and now we're left with another factory that can't keep up. Some of it is related to shortages. I'm trying to think of an example recently on price, and I'm struggling with that because honestly, as a hospital, you would never not give a medication to a patient based on price. You would just try to, I'm thinking of nitroprusside, what happened in the year 2015. Nitroprusside is a generic drug that has been around forever. And it's crucial that it's an IV drip drug that you give to patients with very severe hypertension. Their blood pressures are so high that they could have a stroke or a heart attack. And literally within months, it went from $40 a vial to over $800 a vial. And that and 2 or 3 other drugs cost us an incremental $4 million that year. But you know what? We gave them to the patients because you had to do it. So I'm trying to think about price as a factor in, we did try to figure out if there were substitutes in certain, absolutely. But in the end, we gave the drug because it was the right thing to do for the patients. But drug shortages is a fascinating topic that we wrestle with every day. So thanks for bringing that up.
And I would add in here that these are closely allied fields, that the same things that place a drug at risk for shortage there's a very similar set of factors that place the drug at risk for a price hike, right? To say, like, you have a reduced number of manufacturers.
Chicken and the egg.
Yeah, and so they do move together, which is to say that it's part of the expanded public health justification by which the Food and Drug Administration has taken action recently to try and create a fast track for non-competitive off-patent medications, so that there can be an acceleration of generic competitors. Which is to say, it's it's one of these tricky points for the United States where the FDA is not supposed to take economic considerations into account in general. Right? There are regulatory agencies, science-based regulatory agencies, supposed to look at efficacy and safety. They're supposed to ensure consumer well-being, but recognizing here is an area in which there is actually such a confluence between pricing problems and shortages actually has helped the FDA take some action in this arena.
And that's a very good point. Looking at it, it's more in my mind the chicken and the egg.
Yeah.
Some of the shortages are real opportunities for the price hikes that we face. Thank you for that connection.
Go ahead.
Hi, Lisa Chu. I'm with brainfacts.org, and I just had one question. One of the things that I haven't heard in this discussion is that some of the very basic research that is being done is being funded by U.S. taxpayers. In fact, an awful lot of it is that has, turned into the discoveries that allowed us to lay the groundwork for the new drugs, and some of the blockbusters that have been around are the really, transforming ones. And is it a political issue that that's not being brought up in general overall, or is it just a failed argument at this point? Because I know, 15 years ago they were bringing this up.
You go ahead.
Well, I would just say I don't think it's a failed argument. Which is to say, it's not an argument that has actually resulted in action. But I do think that there is a substantial question of who would exercise marchin rights, right? And so, and I think marchin rights and Bayh-Dole were brought up earlier, right? So I think there are a number of very credible arguments as to how the federal government could take a very close look at areas in which marchin rights would be a very reasonable step to help make sure drugs were more accessible. But I don't see any of the relevant parties that could do so really taking steps to do that right now. Okay.
Yes, and that's such a great point. I think about the NIH dollars, which are taxpayer dollars, funding the bench research that then translates years later into a valuable medication. So, thank you.
There are two thoughts that this brought up I wonder if you could speak to. Dr. Greene, you particularly, I wonder if the research that the military did some years ago on expiration dates of drugs has spread to the dating of drugs for more general use. And the other question is if you'd say anything about where the drug manufacturer and pricing fits with worldwide drug counterfeiting.
So I wish I could say more about how the military's work on expiration has led to impacts in drug pricing, but I haven't seen it. But I'd be interested in having you expand a bit more on your ideas and where it would.
My understanding is that they examined drugs, expiration dates, and said the drugs were quite good, well past the dates, maybe a little bit weaker, and acted on, I assume that their policy for the VA and for the military medical establishment was based on the results of that research. That was my understanding. And I wondered if that is correct, and I don't recall from when I was studying this, whether that has resulted in any change in the expiration dates that are listed for drugs more generally. And it is, I don't know. I was
only in my own medicine cabinet at home, just like, oh yeah, that's still good. I'm going to keep that. No, I think you brought up a very good point, and we talk about it in our own pharmacies in the hospital. But right now, no one, to my mind, at least not on a hospital or a health system level, no one's willing to do that. We pay very close attention to the expiration dates and follow it. But your point, in the era, if we were to have a national emergency and our national stockpiles, I'm not up to speed on where we are, whether those rules have changed or not, so forgive me, perhaps they have, and perhaps they are keeping Cipro for anthrax longer or not, I just don't know. But if drugs are more readily available because the expirations aren't as strict as they used to be, could that impact pricing in some degree? I have not given that the appropriate thought, but that's an interesting comment.
Yeah, thank you for that. As for your second question on counterfeit drugs, I'm personally quite interested in accusations of counterfeit because the birth of the generic drug industry was mired in accusations from the brand name industry that all generic manufacturers were counterfeiters. And so on the one hand, we have to be careful about what allegations of counterfeit drugs do, much like the question of does a drug not work if it's a couple days past that expiration date. Yet at the same time, we know from very careful empirical work that drug counterfeiting is a substantial problem. I think it's most well known, most well documented in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in the context of the HIV/AIDS pandemic and what happens with drugs moving over, particularly from Chinese and Indian manufacturers to sub-Saharan Africa, in which it affects practices where many patients will assume that they need to take a higher dose of drugs to have a better chance of actually getting the amount of drug that they need into their body to manage their disease. Now, what does that have to do with American pharmaceuticals? You know, it's increasingly a problem for the FDA in recognizing the globalization of drug production. The last report I saw on this topic for the FDA and how it actually monitors, oversees elements of the drug production change was that the average active pharmaceutical ingredient, or API, goes through more than 80 different locations in the process of its preparation. So actually figuring out how the FDA can leverage its admittedly, we all would wish for better funding for the FDA. I think, for the resources that it has in so many sites around the world to try to accurately make sure that drugs that are approved for sale in the United States are what they say that they are. So that's to say that I'm sympathetic to this problem being one simultaneously of politicization, but also of an empirical reality that is more complex by the increased globalization of pharmaceutical production in the 21st century.
Well, I think we're near the end of our time, so I'll just thank you. I just want to say one thing, though, because value came up a few times. One of the funniest exchanges and with the most insightful and recently deceased health economist, Uwe Reinhardt, one of the last things we talked about, he sent me a slide he had of value-based medicine, and he had a picture of like a guy on a desert just like crawling behind his camel, and he was like, to the man in the desert, the value of a bottle of water is infinite, and that is what might happen with value-based pricing. Just as a kind of interesting, this is definitely where drug pricing is headed next, and there are a lot of good arguments to have, but there's also a trap there that I felt was really interesting to be warned about. So,
Value to a population versus value to a single patient when issue is very different. It's a different lens.
And there's a piece by colleagues Altenbock and Peter Bach on the problem of the multiple different things that call themselves value-based pricing, in which they identify basically 5 completely different frameworks that are all considered value-based pricing, which can be invoked by different stakeholders at a given moment in time. So I think this idea of watching carefully what value is when we agree that value-based pricing is the future is going to be very important for all of you that are reporting on this issue in the future.
thank you both.
Thank you all.
so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for your questions.